Welcome to our Zoom crew. We're glad that you are joining us, and to everyone here, welcome back. So this is the Becoming Well adult education class. Everybody's in the right place, right? Matt Rhodes, Reverend Matt Rhodes, has been our teacher for the past 4 weeks, and he's going to be here this week and next week. Next week will be his last week teaching. So any questions you've been storing up, things that you want to ask him about this week and next week are your big chances, but he's also available via email, so not too much pressure there. And then the following week after that, we'll be doing just kind of a wrap-up session, and that will be our last session of this class. So we're grateful that you have joined us for this journey. It's been really meaningful and fruitful and thought-provoking. And the discussion group leaders and myself are thinking about kind of what are the next steps that we want to offer at APC. Obviously, we've been diving into deep waters together, and especially in the discussion groups, been sharing vulnerably with each other. And so we want to be thinking about how could we take this one step further and not just be done with it at the end of this class. So if you have ideas, or if you want to be involved in whatever's next, around kind of mental health at APC, come and chat with me or send me an email and I will follow up with you. As we get started, would you pray with me? God, thank you for this morning. Thank you for a chance to come together to worship you and to learn about you. Thank you for this class and for what it has taught us about ourselves, about our relationships, about our families, and for the ways that you are bringing transformation in individuals' lives here at APC. Thank you that by your Holy Spirit, when you transform us as individuals, you transform the relationships that we're in, you transform the whole. And so I pray that here at APC, we would become well, that we would be people who pursue wholeness as we follow you, Jesus, someone who was truly well. Yeah, would you bring about transformation in our midst and show us how to be your hands and feet in this local community that we find ourselves planted in. I pray over Matt today as he teaches, as he brings his knowledge and his expertise to us, God. Would you be speaking through him and teaching through him by your Holy Spirit? We pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Matt.
So good to be back with you all. As Lindsay was naming that this is my penultimate week with you, I felt a twinge of sadness. I've really enjoyed being with you all and connecting with so many of you between the sessions or after the sessions as well. So thank you for how much you've been engaging all of this and how meaningful a process you've helped to make that for me, and hopefully it's been somewhat so for you as well. A couple, or at least one disclaimer, and then I'm going to go back to the end of last session and then we'll get into this session in earnest. If I'm not making any money by selling products or anything, it's not that kind of disclaimer of a medical. If I recommend anything, don't take it. The disclaimer I want to offer is if things are coming up for you while listening to this and searching through all of this, there's a reason for that, and it's because you're human. If nothing is coming up for you in this class, I would probably be a little concerned because you're not in touch with the life that you've lived, the life that you're currently living, how you've been impacted by others in the world, especially during moments of extreme vulnerability, or how you have parented others or been a part of a family, all of these sorts of things. It is very normal and natural for those kinds of things to come up. I think one of the most difficult things, I said from the very first session, that it's not, that no one ever died of a feeling, but a lot of people have died by trying to avoid their feelings. So if feelings are coming up, it's an opportunity to be able to explore them, to be able to say, I wonder what this might teach me now. Because I can say that when I drive home and when I have lunch with my wife and kids after these Sundays, I've said, I was telling all these people to think about this kind of stuff, and I realized I haven't really thought about all of this for myself, and here's what's coming up for me, and can we talk about that? So I offer that to normalize that that's precisely what's supposed to happen. And I'll tell you that that every single student or staff person that is a chaplain in my department, I strongly encourage them that they should be in therapy and that they should have a clergy person that they can always go to for support. I have, in my whatever years in ministry, 12 or so, I have always had both a clergy person I can go to and a therapist that I see regularly, precisely because I work so close to other people's suffering that it would be impossible for my own pain not to come up. And in good conscience to care for those people while I'm responsible for doing that work of my own. So I think there's kind of a changing awareness that we have culturally, especially through the pandemic, that getting support for the things that are part of being human is not something to be pathologized, but something that we all need. None of us can exist on our own without support from others. Does that make sense? It's a disclaimer. Okay. So I want to respond to two questions from last week that I don't feel like I gave either enough attention or good enough answers to. So the first one was around providing leadership in a family, especially if expecting Thanksgiving to come up. I mentioned the Murray Bowen, the famous marital and family therapist who wrote a letter to all of his extended family with all the secrets of the family to get him out there before Thanksgiving. They were all really mad at him, understandably, but afterwards it changed their relationships. So I think the clearest answer that I want to give to that question, and I can only speak to it with a certain amount of imagination because I don't know the specific examples, but a kind of general template is to be very clear on who you are and what is important to you before you have the conversation. That in a caring conversation with anyone who needs to hear it, you need to communicate both what your hopes are and also what your boundaries are. This is what I hope will happen between us. Here's what I'm not going to be able to tolerate. Here's what can't happen. And to not say it in a scolding way, not to say it in an anxious or punitive way, but just to be very clear and non-reactive. Here's where I stand, and this is not what I'm going to experience. So especially when you communicate that which you will not put up with, do it in a non-anxious, non-blaming way, where these interactions frequently go wrong, is that the conversation becomes a chance for one person to win and for another person to lose. And that it creates the very reaction in the other person that was hoped would stop. What happens is instead of talking about the issue, it becomes an interpersonal conflict, if that makes sense. So that's something that you always have to try to avoid. We're not trying to hash it out or to be at each other's throats. We're just here to say, here's where I stand, here's where you stand, and if we're going to do this together, here's how this has to happen. So it's very important to be forward-looking rather than focused on past faux pas. They will want the problem to be an interpersonal problem between the two of you, and your hope is to invite them to be aware that that problematic behavior won't be welcome in your presence, and that you also love them very much. Those two things are both true. And if they actually feel your love for them, it becomes much more difficult for them to channel their internal conflict into an interpersonal conflict. With me so far? And when they try to make it a fight between you, you can respond calmly and say that you don't care to blame or to fight, only that you want to be clear about what is important to you. Your goal is to be as non-reactive as possible and to say no to the fight in the conversation while remaining in touch with the part of you that cares for them, while also not compromising on your boundary. It's very hard to do all of those things at the same time. It takes practice, it takes work. It's hardest to do it in the relationships with the people we're very closest to. The most is at risk there. But the more you can be clear about who you are, what you are going to do, what you aren't going to do. I have a colleague who's a psychologist that whenever one of his patients goes to see family for a holiday, he says, so what are you going to do that you can be proud of who you were when you leave? You don't get to control how it goes, but how can you not feel bad about yourself? How can you feel like you did what you should have done during that time? How can you focus on your output even though you don't get to control the outcome? So the other question, I think it might have been you in the back that asked about, I think it was you, maybe I missed, okay, was about if we're talking about family systems and we talk about the church as a family, well, how might we apply some of this to what we do here? So I'm going to tell an example. Is that close enough to the question? Okay, so I'm going to tell an example that I think will illustrate some of that, and we can open it up further if that would be helpful. So a friend and colleague of mine that I went to seminary with who does ministry in another part of the country, in another region, she was recently working on her performance review that she does every year with the church and was asked about specific job functions, but also about the wider realities of what she sees in the congregation. Give us feedback to the personnel committee about what you see here, because you get to see things that we don't always see. So she debated how honest to be, but ultimately thought it was important for the personnel committee to know a bit more of how their church functions, especially since the lay people almost never see it. Only the pastor normally does. So when a very involved layperson had very recently been exposed to some of it, and he was shocked, she realized, oh wait, there's things that I see, that I experience. The phrase that people use is how the sausage gets made, you know, behind you. You have a great meal, but that's not always the most pleasant process of how you arrive at that meal. So the pastor was also shocked that the layperson had been blind to many of these realities before. So in the performance review and the evaluation, the pastor more or less drew a map for the personnel committee of the church. Here's what things look like, the interlocking relationships and social realities, and how things get passed around to different people. And so there were the official boards and the committees and those kinds of things where authority is properly delegated and responsibility is to be taken up for decisions. However, there are also, for this pastor, this friend of mine, two other groups that don't appear on any official organizational chart that are very influential and wield extensive power in the life of the church. And they're both friend groups of about half a dozen families each. They've known each other for decades and decades and decades, and they spend a lot of time with each other outside of church as well. They're wonderful people. They care about the church deeply, but also there's a bit of an echo chamber that happens. And if one person knows it, everybody else in that group knows it. And very rarely is the person who's most upset the one that comes to talk to the pastor. Instead, they send 4 other people that say, oh, this is a really big problem. A lot of people are upset about this. And it's probably one person primarily who's fanning all of these flames. But of course, there's secrets, there's gossip, there's people not taking emotional responsibility for their own roles. And also, part of what was happening is that certain conversations and decisions would be made on certain committees or boards, and people would come into the pastor's office to complain about those, and they weren't on that committee or board. How do they know about it? It's because they knew other people in the friend group that then had shared it with them. So there was this dysfunction that was happening that was very much undermining both pastor, but also the official bodies of the church, because the session was ultimately not getting to make all of the decisions at the end of the day because the deck had already been laid before the session got to the conversation about it. Make sense to me, to everybody so far? Now, these groups could also be some of the biggest supporters for the pastor, but when they were upset about something that didn't go their way, they would become the vast majority of that week or month of where the pastor's time would have to go. So it was important for the personnel committee to know, because the pastor's job description would get changed when these people were upset. It would be to take care of them and to make sure they're not too upset, rather than to do all of the other things that are in the official job description. The org chart is different from what it actually looks like officially. The job description is actually different from what it's supposed to look like. And so the idea is, if the pastor sees this, how do I, instead of consenting to this and having to deal with these dynamics behind the scenes, how do I make them public? And to actually let the personnel committee have to take it on and give them responsibility for it. Now, it just so happened that the majority of the people on the personnel committee belong to one of those two groups. Isn't that how it happens? But the pastor had realized in the first few years of their ministry there, they wouldn't have been able to do this. But sometime around 4 to 6 years, oftentimes pastors have the kinds of relationships and the trust and some of the authority that they need to be able to address some of these things that are difficult to talk through. So I've got more on that, but to not spend too much time on it, part of this is to say the way in which these kinds of alliances, these kinds of secrets, these places where Influence is used inappropriately and communication is shared inappropriately. And these behind the scenes sort of dynamics were very much undermining the official channels, regardless of what decision is the right decision. The decisions were being made differently because the people who were wielding a lot of this persuasive power were not the ones who were supposed to necessarily have it. And so part of the way to be able to undo a lot of that is to not consent to the secret dynamics. Just as Murray Bowen wrote the letter of all the secrets to the family members, this pastor wrote in the performance review, just to the personnel committee, not to the whole church, I need you to know that this is happening behind the scenes because a lot of you won't be able to see it. Even the ones who were involved in it were surprised. They didn't know that was happening. It wasn't fully conscious for all of them. And so actually by simply naming that dynamic and the inappropriateness of some of the relationships, after a while, it started to dissipate some. When you acknowledge that you see the thing that's hidden, it takes away a whole lot of the power from it. And so that's one way that I find churches connect a whole lot like families. The individual text threads or phone calls that happen. Murray Bowen also, his mother at one time called him to complain about how frustrated she was with his dad. And he said, okay. And by the end, he hung up the phone and called his dad to say, hey, you should know your wife's really upset with you. You should probably talk to her about it. His mom was very upset, but it took him out of the triangle and for them to have to address the conflict where it properly belonged as the parents. So it's somewhat of an illustrative example, but I hope it gets at some of how family systems might relate to congregational life as well. Any questions, concerns, thoughts before we jump in fully into the topic for today? Okay. I'll invite you to, as we go along today, be thinking about what's perhaps the most important learning that you've gotten for yourself during our weeks together. And then also what's the thing that's rubbing you the most difficult? What's the part of you that you're finding, or the part of what I've said that feels unresolved for you that might be worth asking a question about or bringing up or sharing in your small group? Just to invite you to be reflective in this process. So today, the plan is for us to talk about three things primarily, and I'm more than glad to talk about other topics too, but I see these as kind of special topics in mental health and mental wellness. So they are specifically the categories of mental illness, as well as domestic violence, as well as addictions. One thing that all three of them share is there tend to be a lot of shame shrouding all of them. It's part of why it's very important for us to be able to talk about it in a public setting like this, to take away some of the stigma and some of the shame from it. So when you think about mental illness, and this will be a review for some of you who know more about this, most clinicians divide mental illness into primarily one of two categories, either mood disorders or personality disorders. So the easiest way to think about this is that mood disorders typically are responsive to some kind of medication. They benefit also from therapy as well. But mood disorders, there are medications that can help a lot with them. Personality disorders, on the other hand, there is not medication typically that is going to help someone with that. It's typically going to be being in therapy for a long time, oftentimes individual and group therapy that helps with that. So the two main kinds of mood disorders are bipolar disorder and depression. There's other iterations of those, but those are the kind of the two big buckets for us to think about. Bipolar, and there's technically two kinds of bipolar and then a third variation of it, but the broad strokes of it is when someone both has very high highs for an extended period, oftentimes at least 7 days in a row, and then very low lows for a long time following after that. And they might be in the middle for some time in between. But for instance, one of the intake questions that a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist will ask for someone who very well might have bipolar 1, especially that has a lot of high highs, is how many passports do you have? Because there is an experience of invulnerability that can co-occur with the experience of the mania of those highs, where someone might have a passport in 5 different names, or how much credit card debt do you have? That when someone is manic and doesn't feel any sense of vulnerability or limitations, they might go and spend $20,000 in a shopping spree when they would never normally do that under certain circumstances. Or do you ever find yourself driving 130 miles per hour on the interstate? Most of us don't, but people who are in the experience of mania don't have that kind of built-in check on themselves in that experience. There's a sense of invulnerability of I can do anything. I'm all powerful. It's very scary because we need that appropriate fear to not do things like that that can be very dangerous. So that's bipolar, is a mix of being really high and then also being very low. It's a mood disorder. It's something that happens to the body. There's all sorts of theories and research and studies about how it originates. The short of it is that it's some combination of genetic inheritance and environmental factors, is what people will typically say. So the other main mood disorder is depression, and that can take a number of different diagnostic categories, from unipolar depressive disorder to major depression disorder, to all sorts of other kinds. And depression, probably doesn't need to be as explained as much, although part of the difficulty is it's become almost a common linguistic phrase that someone says, I'm feeling depressed today. Well, that's not actually what that means. Depression, to get major depressive disorder, the symptoms would have had to have lasted for 2 years, not as long for unipolar depressive disorder. But it is a sustained period of time where there is both disinterest in the kinds of experiences that normally would appeal to someone, oftentimes a disruption with sleep, oftentimes a disruption with appetite, oftentimes a disruption with focus and attentiveness. The kind of vigor and zest for life that normally gets one out of bed to go start doing things during the day, one often lacks, and so one wants to stay in bed. Now, how does depression come about? There's all sorts of different schools of how to describe this. Is it a behavioral thing? Is it in your mind? Is it your feelings? Is it what's happening on a biochemical level? Is it the neurotransmitters? And the short of it is probably yes. And that many of those are different ways of saying the same thing. One of the things they've realized is that people with certain levels of elevated types of neurotransmitters earlier on in life are much more susceptible to depression later in life, as well as people with higher rates of adverse childhood experiences are much more susceptible to depression later in life. I had a fascinating conversation years ago with an educator and a Quaker leader named Parker Palmer, and he's written a book about his experience of depression as well as his experience of vocation entitled Let Your Life Speak. And he told me that a friend of his, who's an evolutionary neurobiologist, which I didn't know how to spell all of that, seems like a very big job description, job title, said that not for all cases of depression, but the working theory that he had of why does depression exist? Why would it be a useful experience for a human being to be able to have? And his theory is that depression is the body's way of almost shutting the organism down to say, stop going in that direction that you're going in, because the direction that you're going in is a path toward your own destruction. And so it almost is an off switch, a fail safe, to be able to stop someone from going down a direction that might not be as conducive or healthy or constructive for them. I don't wish to apply that to all experiences of depression. I also think that it would be very uncaring to tell anyone, well, this is why you have depression, because to experience depression, you need people to be able to enter into your experience, not to be able to stay outside of it and to explain it, because oftentimes the explanations involve blaming and isolating people. But I do offer that to say that I've had 2 experiences of depression in my own life. And looking back on them, they were utterly miserable experiences at the time. And completely separate from that, there were things that I learned about how I had been living and things that I hadn't reckoned with that caught up to me in those experiences that became sources of wisdom for me about how I wanted to live afterwards. There were things I wanted to stop doing, or things I wanted to stop running away from, or whatever it might be. Some of the things that I've been teaching about in the previous 4 weeks are some of the kinds of things that I was learning on the other side of those bouts of depression. Does that make sense to folks? It's a little bit of a controversial take, but I think it's something worth considering. A former student of mine who's a modern Orthodox Jewish woman, one of the phrases she would use from her own tradition was, "Don't ever let a good illness go to waste." That in the midst of suffering, there also can be a lot of learning. In fact, most of us aren't paying attention enough when things are going really well to learn from it. It's oftentimes when we're brought to our knees that we end up learning something that otherwise we might not. So bipolar and depression, the two primary forms of mood disorders. As for personality disorders, there's 10 primary personality disorders, and I'll go through them briefly and describe a couple of them. So borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, and dependent personality disorder. So the ones that folks have probably heard the most about of those would be narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. OCD, both, there can be a personality disorder and a mood disorder related to OCD, so that's a little bit more complicated. But to start with those first two, because they're kind of polar opposites in certain ways. And before I go into this, I want to say that all of these sort of personality diagnostic categories, it's not either 0 or 100 for any one individual. I would say it would be impossible for even those of us who are considered completely healthy, which I'm not sure there is such a thing, to have some characteristics of each of these. The purpose of this is not to stigmatize those who have it, but to try to understand the human experience and how it impacts us in relationships. So narcissistic personality disorder are people for whom a lot of their life and a lot of their relationships are about them. And it oftentimes has very hurtful and negative impacts upon the people around them. They often come across as overly prideful in many ways. But as we all know, people who are overly prideful are typically just as insecure, if not more so, than the rest of us. Why do you need to show everyone how great you are all the time and to talk about how proud you are of yourself if you actually felt okay with who you are on the inside? I don't want to say too much, but there's someone who had been in the news for a long time who was constantly trying to convince everyone how they were better than every single other human being. And for a lot of people who had had experiences, and you can agree with that person's policies or not, that's not what I'm here to talk about at all. But what I can say is that therapists got really busy because a lot of people, especially who grew up with parents with narcissistic tendencies, it brought all sorts of things back up for them. So narcissistic personality disorder is the real limitation in many ways is the capacity to be able to look at something or experience something from someone else's perspective. Empathy. The focus on any interaction is what I get out of it rather than how it might impact you. There are ways to be able to help reframe some of that experience for other people. A lot of the thought and the theories around it is that those were people who probably didn't get, rather than being overly indulged as children, they're probably people who didn't get enough indulgence as children. So there's a certain tragedy behind it, that the pain they're giving to other people is the pain that they actually experienced as little children. It's not to excuse the behavior, but it is helpful to be able to be aware of it. Of that most of the people that walk around that wound other people, which on some level is all of us, none of us get away from doing that. But the people who tend to wound people around them a lot are people who have a lot of their own wounds as well. So both, while you might need to assert boundaries, there's also a need for compassion as well. Does that make some sense of narcissistic personality disorder for folks? So the other one that you hear the most about typically is borderline personality disorder. And similarly, there's often a very even more tragic history for a lot of people with borderline personality disorder. So a lot more women than men are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. There's some controversy around that. Is that a function of social bias that we have, that people in medicine and psychology have toward women? Or is it because there's certain kinds of social experiences that women have that are unique that make them more inclined to have borderline personality disorder? So typically, people who have borderline personality disorder also have a significant history of some kind of trauma. And in many cultures, and certainly in this country, I think I'd shared, and I'll share some about domestic violence in a bit, but part of what I do outside of here is I serve as the board president for Women's Base in Mercer County that provides services to people who've experienced domestic violence or sexual assault. And so a lot of people who end up being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are people who have oftentimes experienced some kind of sexual assault before. People who have borderline personality disorder oftentimes vacillate between two experiences of don't abandon me on this end versus give me some space on this end, don't engulf me. That they don't want to be left altogether alone, but it's terrifying to have someone too close for good reason, as you can imagine, based on a traumatic history. Oftentimes what ends up happening is that in situations where no one is seeking to victimize them, they might feel very victimized. And instead of saying it's all in their head and they're trying to make it up, one way of trying to conceptualize of that reality is that they haven't experienced resolution and healing from the trauma that they've experienced previously. And one of the ways we get healing is by working out some of the stuff with people that are safe enough to work it out with that we couldn't with the people that weren't safe enough to work it out with. Oftentimes when someone gets mad at their therapist in therapy, maybe the therapist is a bad therapist, or it might be that it's safe enough in that very interaction that they can confront someone when they had a difficult feeling, even if the difficult feeling wasn't actually toward that therapist. It's something that existed in a previous relationship where they couldn't actually address it. Getting mad at your therapist in that sense is normally a good thing because they're able to explore it with you and to help bring resolution to something that might not have been resolved before. And so borderline personality disorder, one of the things that's very difficult is that when someone says, hey, you're victimizing me, it both induces a sense of shame in the other person, but also a sense of anger in the other person. How dare you tell me I'm hurting you? I'm actually trying to help you. And so what often can happen is this repetitive cycle in which the person that they're accusing this of unconsciously feels inclined to re-perpetuate the very thing, some kind of anger or destructive response that that person had been traumatized by before. It's very difficult for someone with borderline personality disorder to hold their own. We talked last week about being responsible for our own emotions, for our own feelings. It is a very difficult thing for someone with borderline personality disorder to do. Oftentimes, so there's only about 10% of therapists who work with people with borderline personality disorder because it can be such a difficult emotional experience. And part of what's really essential is to have very clear boundaries of this is when the appointment will start, this is when the appointment will end. This is when you'll get a bill, here's how much you're gonna need to pay me and when you're gonna need to pay me. Here's when you can contact me outside of our sessions, here's when you can't contact me outside of our sessions. And holding those boundaries will oftentimes evoke a lot of anger. If you don't really care about me, you're not willing to open up your whole life to me, you're just like those people before. But one of the most important things is to be able to remain firm with those boundaries of, no, this is what I need to do because I have my own life. I also really care about you. And when they do have that anger that is not properly directed toward that person, to not react to it. So as much as possible, let it roll off your back. That what is very healing for those folks is to be able to be in a relationship where someone can have their own boundaries that keep both of them safe. And that the care is not dependent upon the emotional expression that they have. It's very difficult for families. It's a lot easier for someone who's a trained person to do that, who's only interacting with them an hour a week or so. Does that make sense? Some sense for the experience of borderline personality? I imagine as I describe those two personality disorders, there's probably people in your own life that have come to mind. One of the one of the things that's very important for people that do CPE with me, the clinical training program we have, is most of us as clergy, we almost always think that more helping is going to make someone better, rather than sometimes you actually need to let people have the chance to become responsible for themselves. And that's especially the case oftentimes with people with borderline personality disorder. The part of the problem is a lot of their agency, a lot of their own actions have been taken away from them. And so part of the healing process is to be able to give them permission to be able to take up the appropriate responsibilities and to act on their own behalf, rather than becoming overly responsible for them. Okay. I've got a lot more to say, so I'm going to try to do it quickly. Hard transition, well, not too hard of a transition, but to transition from mental illness to domestic violence. As I said before, something that links a lot of these topics is the shame surrounding a lot of them. Also, the next topic that we're going to talk about is addictions. And there is a ton of connection between people who have experienced domestic violence and people who have addictions. It's a way to medicate and to be able to bring down some of that sense of unsafety, sense of alarm, that sense of danger. So I printed out like 25 copies of these, and as I got my kids out of the house, dropped them off at our church, I left them at home. But I will send Esther a link of both of them. I'm also going to describe them right now for folks too. So the organization that I work with, Women's Space, what they do is they never tell someone what their experience is, if it is a domestic violence situation or not. What they do is they hand someone a one-page sheet of paper. And on the front side is a description of certain kinds of experiences that are related to domestic violence. And on the other side is a description of relationships where there is equality between the two people. So the biggest misconception is that domestic violence is about bruises. That is one outcome, one manifestation of a relationship where there's domestic violence. But domestic violence is primarily about three things: having all the power, having all of the control, and exerting that power and control by instilling fear in the other person. Power, control, fear. That those are the three things that come together. What I'm going to share are simply, it is actually a wheel, are different spokes on the wheel, but at the very center is the power and control that is the heart of it. So the different categories are using intimidation, making the other person afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing animals. That's a huge red flag, that if someone is willing to abuse a harmless or kill a harmless animal, a vulnerable animal that has no recourse, it's a very big red flag. Displaying weapons. Secondarily, so there's 8 of these that I'll share. Using emotional abuse, putting the person down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them think they're crazy, playing mind games, humiliating them, making them feel guilty. So a big part of this is when someone is appropriately upset about something, to tell them that they're just making it all up and creating a big stir and being hysterical. I had someone that I was working with a number of years back, who her spouse, who she was still married to a few years ago, had put a pistol to her head. And she was constantly minimizing it and saying, oh, it wasn't that big a deal. It's not really who he was. He was just really upset at the time, which domestic violence is not about fits of anger. It's about patterns of power and control inclined to instill fear in the other person. And so she was constantly minimizing the experience. And when we talked about it, what had happened was, at the time, he then put the gun down and said, I wasn't going to do anything. Why are you getting so upset about that? When you have an appropriate experience of alarm and fear and you express it, and then the other person tries to teach you that you're ridiculous for having such an appropriate response, is a very important part of this category. So third, using isolation, controlling what the other person does, who they see, who they talk to, what they read, where they go, limiting their outside involvement, using jealousy to justify actions. Fourth, minimizing, denying, and blaming, making light of the abuse, and not taking their concerns seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior. I think I'd mentioned the phrase before, look at what you made me do. No one can make anyone else do anything. People are responsible for their own actions, but oftentimes the responsibility gets shifted in these kinds of relationships, or saying that they caused it. Fifth, using children, making them feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass them, or threatening to take the children away. Fifth is using privilege. Sixth is using privilege, treating them like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, or the king or the queen of the castle, and being the one to define whose role is what. Seventh is using economic abuse, and it's preventing them from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money, giving them an allowance, taking their money, not letting them know or have access to family income. And that's on that one, sometimes people divide those up and it's a mutual decision to do it. For instance, there are certain things with finances that I do in our family and certain things that my wife does. And we've agreed on that. There's a separation of responsibilities. And so that's not what this is describing. This is when another person wants access and they're denied to it. And then the eighth one is using coercion and threats, making and or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the other person, threatening to leave them, threatening to commit suicide. So this is a very strange one, for a counterintuitive one for a lot of people of, well, isn't abuse about hurting the other person, not about hurting themselves? But part of what happens is that when they threaten to kill themselves, they have made their partner or their spouse completely responsible for that outcome. I'm going to do this because of you, and you're going to be responsible for it. And they know they wouldn't be able to live with themselves if that happened. And so it's a way to use that power and control and instilling fear to be able to get them to do whatever they want. Does that make sense to folks? Threatening to report them to welfare, making them drop charges, or making them do illegal things. So that's on one side. And if one or two things come up for someone, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a domestic violence situation. The real discrepancy is when there's a lot from that side, and then the other side of the sheet, there's not a whole lot of evidence of equality in the relationship. And I'll share that now. Excuse me. So remember, the other side is power and control and ways that domestic violence can happen. This side is equality in the middle, and then other ways that takes shape. So non-threatening behavior, talking and acting so that they feel safe and comfortable expressing themselves and doing things. We talked about this from the very first session on attachment psychology, is that what human beings need is both connection and authenticity. And that if your parents can tolerate your difficult feelings as a child, it makes it way more possible for you to be able to express yourself emotionally later on in life. Your anger doesn't have to threaten your parents. Spouses, I have a psychologist colleague that says a healthy marriage is not a relationship with the absence of anger. A healthy marriage is when there's equal anger on both sides. Normally not an extreme, but where both people can say, hey, I'm kind of mad about this, or hey, I'm frustrated about this. Is that if you can't ever express any frustration or anger, then you're probably shoving it down. But if one person especially is always really angry and the other person is never angry, there's an imbalance there. That's a concern. So on the equality side, the non-threatening behavior, talking and acting so that each person feels safe and comfortable expressing themselves and doing things. Second is respect, listening to them non-judgmentally, being emotionally affirming and understanding and valuing their opinions. Third is trust and support, supporting their goals in life, respecting their right to their own feelings, friends, activities, and opinions. This is a big thing of being able to have one's own life. When the person controls who the other person is able to talk to or not, oftentimes scolding them for talking to other people is a huge red flag, warning sign. Fourth, honesty and accountability, accepting responsibility for self, acknowledging past use of violence, admitting being wrong, communicating openly and truthfully. Fifth, responsible parenting, sharing parental responsibilities, being a positive, nonviolent role model for the children. 6th is shared responsibility, mutually agreeing on a fair distribution of work and making family decisions together. 7th is economic partnership, making money decisions together, making sure both partners benefit from financial arrangements. And 8th is negotiation and fairness, seeking mutually satisfying resolutions to conflict, accepting change, being willing to compromise. So part of what I want to say is that there's probably 3 different kinds of relationships. When you put those 2 different sides of the sheet together, there are mostly healthy relationships, there are dysfunctional relationships, and then there are abusive relationships. And there's a difference between those. And it's not helpful to name that everything is abusive, just as it's not helpful to ignore when something is abusive. But that's the very sheet that they use with someone who comes in and is trying to make sense of what's going on with them, because almost always someone who's experiencing abuse will not recognize it as abuse, because part of what happens is they stop being able to trust their own experience in that process. Any questions on that? Does that make sense to folks? Okay. I also just want to acknowledge that this is very heavy kinds of stuff to be able to talk about. So I apologize for moving through it quickly. I want to save a little more time for questions today, but what I'll say just briefly about addictions is that you all likely know most of the different types of addictions that there can be, and the very language itself is revealing. So typically within psychology now, in psychiatry, it's moved from the language of addictions to the language of substance use disorder. Part of the impetus for that is to take away the sense of blame and shame that's involved in that. Interestingly, 12-step communities still stick with the term addiction. But a lot of psychology has moved to focusing on substance use disorder. So the attempt is to alleviate the sense of shame and blame involved in it. If it's a use disorder, it's not an addiction. But there's an interesting thing that happens there, is that as someone starts using a substance more and more and more, it becomes less possible for them to choose not to use it, because they become addicted, so to speak, to it. On a physiological level, they need it, or else they experience very difficult feelings. The irony is they started using it to relieve difficult feelings, and now it's creating even more difficult feelings than it had before. One of the difficult things when we try to say, oh, well, it's just a substance use disorder, it's just like any other kind of, say cancer or some other kind of physical illness, in order to not shame the person, is part of the very hope for recovery is that the person does have some volition, does have some agency, some active will that they can choose with appropriate supports to not keep using it. So I do think there is a sense in which over time it becomes impossible not to choose it, and someone might need to be in a rehab facility or something like that to be able to constrain them from doing it. But the hope is to be able to create the conditions where that choice becomes more possible for them, and be able to have that support and accountability in community, and not just trying to avoid a substance, but to work on the underlying stuff that results in the need for a substance. That's so much of what 12-step programs are about, as well as about restoring the relationships. I have a dear colleague, Sonia Waters, who teaches at Princeton Seminary, and she wrote a book on addictions and pastoral care recently. And she says, we get it wrong, is that the addiction is not the sin itself. What happens as a result of the addiction, the harm caused to other people, that is sin. But the addiction itself is someone who's in pain trying to find relief from that pain. So there are sinful realities that can emerge from it, but the addiction itself is not the sin, she would say. Going one step further from addiction to substance use disorder, what I actually like best comes from a guy named Gabor Mate, which actually might be he has a book on the wisdom, he has a documentary on the wisdom of trauma that might be a great viewing experience at some point here for APC. But he talks about, instead of addiction or substance use disorder, ritualized comfort seeking. He says that's the most descriptive way of trying to describe what's happening. It's a ritual that someone has taken on that when they feel distress, when they feel difficult feelings, they go to this substance or this ritual in order to try to alleviate that. And part of what he's trying to do is to understand that people who are addicted to these kinds of substances are not people that typically are trying to get high. They're trying to find relief from being so low. So the different kinds of substances can be alcohol, tobacco, opioids, prescription drugs, which we've learned all the more about, cocaine, amphetamines, hallucinogens, inhalants, all sorts of, the list can go on and on. There's also other kinds of addictions that we've talked about in more recent years of sex and love addiction or pornography addiction or addiction to the internet even. You see people, especially a lot of kids, but also a lot of adults, relationships to their phones. Most of the time my phone is on my bedside table at night, and I say it's because I might get an emergency call from the hospital. Well, what's it like to not have your phone right next to you and it not be the first thing that you check in the morning? Some of these things that we all could use to think about some. So I really want to, I think part of the wisdom of the trauma-informed care movement is to focus away from the symptom, which I would say addiction both is a disease, but even more so is a symptom. What is it underneath that's going on that needs to be resolved and cared for and tended to so that someone might not have that kind of dependence? I'm going to stop there. What questions or comments or feedback might you all have as we think about what we've been talking about these last 4 weeks, as well as today around mental illness, domestic violence, and substance use disorder? Yeah.
You mentioned touching base on the borderline personality.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of times they may be looking for comfort or like that safe place.
Yeah.
And in order for us, like a family or something, somebody that has that, to create that comfort space for them to come to. But at what point, where do you draw the line between providing comfort and a safe space to greenlighting that behavior?
Yep. This is a very tricky thing because you both have compassion for the origin of it, and you also appropriately feel anger about the manifestation of it. So part of, yes, Esther, in seeking to understand the experience of someone with borderline personality disorder and their need for safety and care, how do you make sure to be responsible and also get to be a person yourself without greenlighting and agreeing to more destructive patterns of behavior? Is that close? Yeah. So to back up for a second, I would say one thing that I would offer is that when you experience someone with borderline personality disorder, the fancy phrase that's used of what often happens is called projective identification. So what we all know kind of in common lingo is the term projection. So I'm mad at you, but I don't want to actually express that I'm mad at you, so I accuse you of being mad at me. That's projection. When you're giving away your feeling to someone else and accusing and putting it on them instead. Projective identification happens when I say, oh, no, you're really mad at me. And you weren't mad at me before, but I actually, through some kind of mind control, get you to actually become mad at me. And then you enact it toward me. So that kind of splitting, that projective identification is often what happens with borderline personality disorder, is you might not wish to harm someone at all, but then they so come at you in a way that induces all of these difficult feelings that at the end you're like, yeah, I'm really tired of you and I want to be done with this. And so you experience feelings that don't feel consistent with who you know yourself to be in your own character. So the first thing is to be able to recognize, I'm feeling something right now that doesn't actually belong to me. This actually properly belongs to the other person. I don't want to enact it, but I also don't want to have to become responsible for metabolizing all of these difficult feelings. And so I think having very clear boundaries of these are the kinds of ways you can talk to me, these are the kinds of ways you can't talk to me. I really care about you. I also need to have my boundaries for my own life. And I would hope that as someone who cares about me, you would want me to be able to have boundaries for my own life, because I have all these other things going on that are really important to me. I wouldn't want to make a claim on all of your life. And so also appropriately hope that you wouldn't see this as all or nothing. The fact that I can give you some of me doesn't mean that I'm rejecting you. And it actually makes me sad when you accuse me of that. That because I give you some of me, that you say that I'm abandoning, which is oftentimes the dynamic that can happen. Does that sound close? Does that make some sense? I would also say that it's very helpful to be in therapy if you have a family member with borderline personality disorder. Yes.
Some examples of someone who has antisocial mental illness?
Sure. So thank you. Eventually, you're just going to live right here on my shoulder. Examples of someone who has antisocial personality disorder. So it would be similar to narcissistic personality disorder, except people often get harmed by people with narcissistic personality disorder by happenstance. That's not the goal typically of the person with narcissistic personality disorder. Someone with antisocial personality disorder typically is seeking to destroy things or other people. There's oftentimes a lot of an excess of anger, a need to be able to put that somewhere, not much of a desire to be able to interact helpfully with other people. Let me think about this. Typically, someone with antisocial personality disorder would not have the ability to be able to feel badly about what they did afterwards. If someone can reflect on it and to say, oh yeah, that probably wasn't the constructive thing to do, but also I feel bad about that, then that's not going to be an appropriate diagnosis. There's a lot of things that happen. I think I mentioned, the family friend who is 16, who all of the adults in her family were having a lot of problems, and then she started acting out, and her very family actually was thinking maybe that's what she has. What she was doing was she was manifesting a lot of the chaos that she felt, and that was how it was coming out. And so she also in other moments could be very remorseful. So that wouldn't be antisocial personality. Let me think back through into the DSM-6 a little bit more, and I'll have more of an answer. Other questions that folks have?
Where's ADHD? You hear a lot about that fit into all this.
Yeah, so
If you could repeat the question.
thank you. Where does it keeps one humble to be laughed at. Where does ADHD fit into all of this? So I have to tell you that most of the experts that I know feel that ADHD is way overdiagnosed. That so much of it, especially with the increase of technology and phones all the time, is that, I don't know about you, but when I'm underslept, I have a hard time focusing on one thing for a long time. And if I have my phone right next to me, it's buzzing all night because I'm texting with my friends at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., I'm gonna have a difficult time with attention span the next day. And so there is a lot of concern that there is an overdiagnosis of ADHD, or there's also the reality that part of the inheritance of trauma is it makes it very difficult to focus on one thing, because when that chair moved right there, if you've experienced something very traumatic, you might immediately have to look to see, are things safe here? A lack of a sustained attention span can be explained through a number of reasons. I think we as a culture are much more inclined to find explanations in which a pill can resolve. I'm not against psychopharmacology by any means, but I do think sometimes we overly rely on that. There's a lot of financial incentives why it works that way. That said, so ADHD, we oftentimes know of it from children who've been diagnosed with it and put on Ritalin. So it's much more around experiences of self-control is one way to think about it. It's both attention span, it's self-control, it's oftentimes with children, oftentimes people will age out of it. It's in that sense like a mood disorder of you can medicate for it as well as be in therapy for it. Whereas personality disorders, there's no medication that one can use for it. I haven't worked as much with kids myself. I work a lot more with adults, so I don't have as much experience with it, but I hope some of that's a little bit helpful. Any other, we're coming up on time soon.
How often is ADHD diagnosed in adults? I'm curious because a good friend,
Yeah,
lawyer in Princeton, the younger son got diagnosed with ADHD and was put on Ritalin.
Yeah.
And then he went and got tested and decided he was a very successful, still is a very successful lawyer. And I'm sitting there and I couldn't understand that because I thought, wait a minute. If he's managed to control this in his life, why does he suddenly need Ritalin?
maybe he can only focus for 15-minute increments to Bill. It's a little tongue in cheek. So I will say that the vast majority of people making these prescriptions are not psychiatrists. They're oftentimes general practice, family practitioners. The question is about the diagnosis of adult ADHD, staying on task, and how prevalent that is. I don't know how prevalent that is. I can't speak to that, but what I can say is the bias in favor of doing that is that it's an easy, quick fix. How it's perceived, and it's oftentimes occurring by people who that's not their specialty. I find that a lot of psychiatrists are much less likely to jump toward that kind of diagnosis than a lot of other medical professionals that might make such a diagnosis. It's okay for a general practitioner to make those kinds of diagnoses, but I think we are a culture that likes a quick fix, and instead of working on something for a long-term solution, especially if there's an added sort of professional benefit of a person can stay and work on that case law for 16 hours in a day to bill all of that. Normally, these kinds of diagnoses would happen when there is a disruption in one's work life, family life, social life that has caused problems for them. If someone has lived their whole life without significant disruptions in those ways, they probably don't qualify for such a diagnosis. Yeah. I don't want to keep you all from worshiping God. Lindsay.
Would you close us in prayer?
Sure.
Today? It feels
Be glad
like
to.
maybe if things got triggered or.
Sure.
Thank you, Matt.
Let's pray. God, who gives us all good things, we thank you for the good gift of each other here. It's not suffering that redeems, but rather it's love that is willing to suffer that redeems, that Jesus shows us on the cross. You also call us to love each other amidst our own sufferings. So God, as we contemplate, as we reflect on these difficult experiences in our own lives or the lives of people that we care about, or even other people in the world whose lives we haven't touched yet, be with each of us. Remind us that we are safe with you, and help us to build together and knit together the kind of community in which we can share these things with each other, that we can remove shame, we can make people not have to suffer alone, and in so doing, help each other to heal. God, who is our beginning and our end, our source of salvation and the balm of all healing. We ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen.